What I'm actually wanting to talk about is the amount of segregation that exists between all of these different communities that we have in the world, not only of autism, but neurodiversity in general. We have all these different neurotypes, autism and ADHD and others. We have patterns where they co-occur together, like autism and intellectual disability together. We have different age groups, and there's just heterogeneity between even within all of these categories. And then we have our other communities associated with all of this, our communities of parents, our communities of researchers, our communities of professionals, and of course further subgroups within each of these areas. And what people like Christina are up to is really an exception that proves the general rule that ordinarily there is just so little contact between these communities. I used to think before I got involved in research that all of these debates between these communities were like some giant brawl where everybody is constantly fighting one another and kicking and punching in this horrific mess. And then as I started to move out of my community of autistic adults into this research community, and then from there into other communities as well, I started to realize just how little contact there is, how really what people are saying and doing in one community is just going completely past these other communities because of this segregation, so that really we're all just in our own little echo chambers, effectively. And so as a result of all that, we have these very large differences in the substance of our opinions on these issues, and even beyond those big substantive differences, we also have differences in the language and the rhetoric that we use. Like, for example, if we're using terms like risk and rescue and disorder and deficit and so on and so forth in a research talk, then even above and beyond technical and incomprehensible jargon, that is going to make that talk really off-putting, if not offensive, to a lot of people who then will not be engaging with the subject material. And a lot of these controversies come back to this whole neurodiversity paradigm, and more particularly its scope. Is this something that we can apply to some autistic people but not all, to all autistic people, all neurodivergent people, or no neurodivergent people at all? One example of an opinion on this comes from these researchers who are using level of functioning terminology, but basically they're talking about people with intellectual disabilities or without intellectual disabilities, autistics with and without intellectual disabilities, and they're saying that neurodiversity should really only be applied to these autistic people without intellectual disabilities. And they say this because according to them, the neurodiversity paradigm is the idea that people do not need care, they do not need supports, and that they do not have a disability. We can get a very different view if we look here at this autistic advocate who wrote an essay saying actually the neurodiversity paradigm is not inconsistent at all with the idea of disability, and in fact we do recognize as autistic advocates that people are in fact disabled. And it's interesting to me that we have all of these disagreements because if we think about something else like the social model of disability that's come up in some of the other talks, this is a much clearer idea. It comes out of the physical disability world. It's the idea that disability is caused by stuff out in the environment, not people themselves. So the classic example would be like the stairs cause a disability, the wheelchair ramp acts as an accommodation there. The social model is very clear. It's what entered discourse precisely defined. The neurodiversity paradigm is not clear. Judy Singer coined the term, and she wrote a very interesting and subtle honors thesis that really only became widely publicly available as a Kindle book a few years ago. Until then, really the neurodiversity paradigm entered discourse through things like this. This article in The Atlantic by Harvey Bloom, which mentions the word neurodiversity in exactly one sentence. So what exactly does that mean? It's pretty vague, and it gives a lot of license for people to interpret it as they see fit. So that means there's a lot of different ideas about what the neurodiversity paradigm exactly means, what are its tenets, that creates the potential for people on one side of the debate or the other to pick a definition that suits their purposes. Like if they are pro-neurodiversity, pick a sensible definition of neurodiversity and a radical, wild, and crazy definition of the competing pathology idea. And really this is in addition to those problems that I mentioned earlier with the segregation of these communities, creating a further situation of incommensurability, that we just don't have a common standard of measurement to weight these ideas against one another. This is the idea from philosophy of science, where you have two world systems and they're so different in their assumptions and jargon and language that you just can't find some common thing to compare them. And I think that we're in an even worse situation in the neurodiversity world. And then, of course, there's this other thing that is really making this a complex debate, that is the question, does this apply only to some neurodivergent people or all or none? Is it different based on all these heterogeneities? And some advocates have responded to this by saying, well, really all autistic people are similar in some fundamental way. But that's not too convincing to me, because I know that there's a lot of autistic people and some of them are extremely different from me. So I think that if it is in fact the case that neurodiversity applies to everyone, that's something that we have to demonstrate. That's not something we can assert. So we unfortunately have the difficulty there that there is no sort of neurodiversity definition that has all these tenets clearly laid out, but what we maybe can do is look at some ideas that are clearly associated with the neurodiversity paradigm or the pathology paradigm and say, you know, do these make sense and applied broadly or just narrowly? And hopefully I won't get too repetitive when I'm going over this. Like, for example, the first point here I have is that the pathology paradigm, you know, what that means is the assumption that there's something fundamentally wrong with somebody. It's certainly in the case of something like autism, which is stable over time, it is pretty pervasive, and it is internal. That's the idea, that there's a stable global and internal problem with people. And Damien, of course, was talking earlier about this pressure to normalize, or at least to camouflage the abnormal stuff. He was using the term that's psycho-emotionally disabling. And I really agree, this is not a good message for mental health to say that people have all these deficits and impairments and stuff. And I don't think that this matters a lot whether your measured IQ happens to fall above or below 70. I do not have an intellectual disability myself, but I know a lot of advocates who do have intellectual disabilities and know of others who I think do have opinions about this sort of thing. And that would tend to suggest that an arbitrary IQ dividing line at 70 is not, you know, defining some people who are invulnerable to this sort of language. Maybe there are people who are invulnerable to this sort of language if you looked hard enough, but another question is, do we even need this idea of deficit? And I'll return to that later. I'm not convinced that it actually helps us. And the other thing here is, if we're always focusing on these deficits, can we look at strengths? Christina was talking, well, actually a lot of people on various panels and speakers were talking about strengths. And there's a reason for this, because strengths really can be a foundation of success, particularly in adulthood. Like Matt was talking about how initially he was going to a job that did not suit his strengths. And that is really what a lot of people have been focusing on in the job market, because there's so many different paths that we could follow, and we want to pick something that is relevant to our own strengths and abilities, that maximizes those. And there's research that extends this into intellectual disability, and again finds, yes, there are identifiable strengths, and those are important when we're doing transition planning, whether it's with regard to employment or some other goal that makes sense for that individual. And then to pivot things slightly differently, the pathology paradigm is really making all of these claims, you know, like about somebody having this objective deficit, that are really setting up this assumption where, as a researcher, we are able to make this objective statement about this person. We're in a position where we have that that objectivity, that authority, that separation. And that just really doesn't make sense, because everybody who is neurodivergent in our world is a neurodivergent person in a society where neurotypical people have had most of the power and most of the organization of society has been done by them. So Dana earlier was already using one of these parodies of the DSM where autistic advocates have been saying, okay, let's take all of this language about the objective deficits of the autistic person, but instead use it to describe neurotypicals. Because it is in fact the case that it is not objective. And for example, with something like especially the social features of autism, if somebody is having trouble with social communication and interaction with a neurotypical person, does it really make sense to just say that it's the autistic person's fault? That's an interactional situation by definition. There are two parties involved. And oftentimes, despite the theory that a lack of social motivation is like the core deficit of autism, it's often autistic people who are motivated to engage socially with neurotypical people who make overtures of friendship and then are rejected or even victimized and scorned, mocked or exploited. Can we really put that on autistic people as a deficit in them? Surely there is more than one side to this. And from that, we naturally get to this other question, which again has come up a lot over the course of the day. Should we be trying to change the individual to normalize them as essentially, or should we be trying to change their context? Because trying to change somebody's context could actually give us a lot more options in terms of intervention and also helps us get away from this complementary and alternative medicine thing where we have all these people who are really taking advantage of individuals and families trying to peddle these not necessarily particularly safe or sensible treatments. And even more broadly than that, if you look at the sorts of interventions that are done, this is a bit out of date, but overwhelmingly here, everything is focusing on the core features, the so-called core symptoms or deficits of autism. There is now, fortunately, more than one study on mental health in autism. That has improved slightly since this came out, but still, the overwhelming balance has not changed. It's still overwhelmingly tilted towards those core features, which is really problematic because often something like, to use the example of employment, something that's addressing the environmental aspects of this, something that's helping somebody with the job search and doing some job coaching, helping to avoid the very problematic social context of the job interview that is so discriminatory against autistic people, that could be extremely effective. You know, you might get success rates that are north of 90%. And yet, the fact remains that even if you look at employment studies, there's still tons of studies that are looking, again, at those core autism features or teaching job skills and so forth, rather than trying to adjust the environment. So this really is this overwhelming bias. Now, a question that comes up is this only a problem, again, for people without intellectual disabilities, or does it extend more broadly than this? And when I was trying to think, okay, what are the supports that we do that are effective for people with intellectual disabilities, or in the case of early intervention, I guess developmental delays, really apart from early intervention itself, most of what I was thinking of, things like community living supports and augmentative and alternative communication, and of course there are others, is really aimed at changing the environment around somebody. And to me, this makes a lot of sense. If we are talking about a population that is somehow further from the neurotypical, then normalization is not going to be very effective at all. If somebody is further from this social construct of the normal, then trying to push them closer to that is going to be less effective than if they're closer. I'm not saying that we want to normalize people when they're closer necessarily, but it seems logical to me that it would make even less sense when they're farther away, which is, I don't know why it's a counterintuitive idea, but it really seems to be running against everything that is being said in these debates. So I think that we really need to rethink how we conceptualize that aspect of it. Now, here so far I've been talking about these 4 areas where I think the neurodiversity paradigm does pretty well. The sorts of things that are associated with it work pretty well. But to be fair, there are areas where there's concerns about the neurodiversity paradigm, and really probably the main one is this fear that we might no longer be able to ever intervene to support people by changing them somehow. And I think that this is actually a useful thing sometimes. As I was saying before, we probably do it far too much now and don't pay enough attention to environments now, but there are circumstances where we want to change people. But I don't think it is necessary that we assume deficit in order to do this. In fact, neurotypical children, they will learn language pretty much automatically. They will not learn math or spelling automatically. We, in fact, have set up an education system premised on the assumption that we will have to explicitly teach math and spelling. We do not call neurotypical kids deficient because we have had to set up the system. We just set up the system. Does it actually make sense that we have to say that somebody is deficient in order that we proceed to do some sort of intervention that is aiming to somehow change them, to teach them a new skill or something? And do we even have to say whether the individual has a deficit or whether it's the environment that's at fault? First of all, I think this is a very difficult question to answer because it really depends on our imagination. You know, I have to imagine all these counterfactual alternate worlds where maybe such and such a thing is accommodated, and, you know, does it make sense to imagine these worlds? Are they feasible? You know, it gets into some really weird territory. Whereas a much more practical question might be, would it make more sense, not in order to normalize the person, but in order for them to thrive, to have good quality of life, that we try and change the individual, teach them new skills or whatever, or that we try to change their environment? And to me, it is not at all the same question as the first one. Like, for example, if we take the example of sensory sensitivity, Erica pointed out some positive sensory features of autism earlier, but the sensory distress that accompanies sensory sensitivity, that specific sensory feature, is pretty negative. It is inherently distressing and bad. It is also caused by something internal in the brain, so I think there's a good case, such as one can make such a case, that this would be a deficit in the individual. But we're not going to be able to intervene to change somebody's brain somehow to remove sensory distress very easily. It's going to be a lot easier to somehow modify the sensory environment around them, either by directly changing the sensory stimuli or putting some kind of technological thing interposed between the individual and their environment. Or to take another example, self-injurious behaviors like headbanging are pretty inherently harmful, and presumably they're caused ultimately by something within the brain of the individual. I think there's a good case to be made there, again, such as one can say such things, that this is a deficit. But if we're going to intervene, again, it's going to be much more effective to try and look at what might be stressing the individual out in their environment and changing that. So I do not think that there is really much of a link here between deficit and teaching skills or interventions that might change people. In fact, I think that the ability to intervene by changing people, by teaching them skills, can be a very useful thing. That if we always accommodated everything and never challenged people, then that would put them into a position of complete dependence, which is not at all what we want. When we're talking about this neurodiversity paradigm, as a self-advocate, that is not at all what I want. What I want people to be is empowered. To be empowered and to have these abilities to succeed for themselves and on their own merits, as much as feasibly possible. And on that note about disempowerment, we really do fail here in terms of supports and services today, because these are supports and services typically that have been set up by a system without the individual's input and offered to the individual after perhaps a long process of advocacy where they have to actually prove they deserve these things. And then it's that dynamic where the individual is then coming as a petitioner, as somebody who is seeking help, as somebody who is saying, you know, I have these deficits, and you, the expert neurotypical, you have this expertise and knowledge that you can use to help me. And it's this sort of charitable idea, this idea that the neurodivergent person is put into a position of complete inferiority, and this is so uncomfortable. Let me tell you, in terms of wanting to ever access services and supports when they're delivered in this way. You don't want to come to somebody as a petitioner in a position of inferiority, asking the neurotypical expert to condescend to help you. You want to be empowered as you access supports. And I really think that we can provide these supports in a way that would get away from this dynamic. It's just that right now that is overwhelmingly not being done. So to summarize everything that I've been saying really quickly, I think that there are some useful ideas in the neurodiversity paradigm. Maybe there's not some complete list of tenets that everybody can agree on, but there are some useful ideas here. And I've mentioned 4 ideas, and some of them have already been mentioned by other people today. And then, of course, there's a lot of other ideas that other people were mentioning today that we might toss in here as well. I also think that we can incorporate these insights into our understanding of the world without saying that we necessarily want to give up the ability to ever change the individual, to teach the individual new skills. On the contrary, we want to retain that because we want people to be empowered and to have abilities to do things for themselves, to be more independent and capable, not completely dependent, within whatever their potential might be, of course. And we would want to, of course, do any such intervention to help people in a way that's empowering, not disempowering. And we aren't going to make progress on these issues without dialogue across these segregated groups. And so I am really, really encouraged by the fact that at this Neurodiversity Summit, we have this super broad audience of people from all manner of disciplines and backgrounds, advocates, self-advocates, and parent advocates, and then all manner of professionals and researchers. We've already been having these wonderful conversations, and hopefully as we go through the remainder of the day, we'll continue to do so and maybe take these conversations beyond this Neurodiversity Summit and into other places as well. So thank you so much for coming.
One of the things I began to think about when you talk about changing contexts and not people, and the condition of somebody who is banging their head and unable to say what's stressing them out, perhaps, is the idea that inside internal context, body states, things like blood sugar levels, the state of your autonomic nervous system in response to regulatory aspects that most people would be able to identify, that somehow eludes you. And so do you actually think about using technological biosensing as part of changing the context so that signals could be given so that a person could regulate themselves without having to reach that level of frustration and without having to articulate in a particular normative way what they need?
I think that's an absolutely fascinating idea. And to tell a little story, last month I was at INSAR, which is the super big autism conference. And because I do sometimes have these difficulties with my awareness of my own body with this interoception, I got completely dehydrated because I forgot to drink water, and I didn't notice on the first day of the conference that I was getting thirsty. It was only on the second day of the conference, when I was already completely dehydrated, that I noticed this. So I was wandering around INSAR on the second day completely dehydrated. And really, I depend on my routine to tell me these things, but I think that what you're saying is an incredibly good idea because it would give another source of information, especially for maybe somebody who has some executive function things and can't keep their routine, or somebody who can't communicate these things as well, so that people around them might know these things. I think it's a great idea.
I'm not exactly clear about what you're saying about the benefits versus the naivety of these kind of programs. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more.
Right. Okay. So this is like I have no like qualifications to talk about this. Just to make this clear, I have neither provided ABA nor do I know how to provide ABA, nor have I undergone ABA. That being said, it is, of course, a super controversial issue because many advocates have been saying that ABA is this awful, horrible, even morally evil and repugnant thing. And yet, on the other hand, I've also talked to some advocates who are making the point like, okay, now I have this language thing that I actually learned through this ABA program, and I kind of appreciate having this language thing because it allows me to communicate with people, and I find that useful. So I personally would not go so far as to say that there is something fundamentally or inherently wrong with the idea of early intervention programs that are aiming to socially engage people so that they can learn information that neurotypical people might learn through early social engagement, but that an autistic person or other neurodivergent person who doesn't have that social engagement might not pick up. That being said, I think that the criticisms that have been made by self-advocates absolutely need to be listened to, that we have a responsibility to listen to these criticisms, to think about what ways we could further modify these programs in order to eliminate some of the concerns that have been raised, and also to think at a broad level about how we deliver these programs, because is this privatized model where, you know, we go out and get these people who really don't have necessarily a huge amount of qualifications and are kind of under the loose supervision of a board-certified behavior analyst in a privatized system that's essentially not super well regulated. Is that really the best way of delivering all of this too? So I'm not going to say that I am anti-early intervention, but I am not going to say that the way that we do things now is necessarily the right or best or only way, and that we have to do everything exactly this way, or that autistic people will be forever doomed, which is kind of some of the rhetoric that we've sometimes heard on the extreme pro or anti sides. I think that there's somewhere in the middle that is hopefully more sensible.
Wow, it's an honor to be asking you a question. You're one of my personal heroes. We're alive, we're here. And this whole summit has been just perfectly organized. I'm just thrilled to be here with every single person here. And the Facebook, yeah. So I'm saying, yeah, it's really shows the community coming together from different segments. It's just to ask for clarification here, because there's a lot in this summary to unpack. But there's an idea that genes and environment change each other in constant, like they epigenetically change each other, but they're always they're synergistically changing. So to change an environment is to change an individual, or to change an individual is to change their relationship to the environment. And also there's this idea of empowering that you talked about, which I think is really a key point. And is there a difference between empowering someone to change their own environment, or for autistic people to change their own environments themselves, or is the intervention for other people to change their environments for them? But since the change of the individual is implicit in the change of the environment, would that be an external agents, changing the individual through environment changes versus the autistic population finding organically together through discussion their own environments and discovering what those are, and changing themselves to another level through that. So just to add clarity where you stand, with my trying to figure this out, what your position is.
Yeah, no, as always, there's a lot to unpack in what you just said. So I think you hit on an important point there, which is that first I say, we have to decide, leaving we unspecified, what's better, changing the individual or the environment, which kind of conjures up this sort of paternalistic image of somebody going there and saying, I think it's best for so-and-so that we do this, and this, and this for them. And then later I'm saying, but it's also a problem that the supports and services are decided on in this way without a lot of input from people. So I mean, I think that yes, there needs to be input from the individual to the point that's appropriate for that individual. And secondly, more broadly, because not all individuals will be able to have input in that, there needs to be input from other relevant stakeholders, like other neurodivergent people who may have a similar experience themselves or may just have an appreciation for being a neurodivergent person in a neurotypical society and the perspectives that that gives them. Parents, anybody who's a stakeholder would have to have a say in that decision. It can't be made by somebody who's approaching it from some one narrow perspective. So I'm not trying to be paternalistic, essentially there, but I did not really super clarify that, so thank you for pointing that out. And then as for the genes and the environment, I mean, yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated, and there is a lot of interplay there, and I'm kind of making everything simplified by saying it's changing the individual or their environment, but maybe you change the individual in such a way that they then are more empowered to change their environment, or you change the environment in such a way that the individual is then more confident and empowered themselves. So it can't really be distinguished in that sharp way. I'm just trying to get at a sort of more general thing, if that answers your questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Patrick, do you have an opinion on what role the American Medical Association would have in changing some of the nomenclature?
So my opinion is that there are cases where some of these professional bodies really do right now probably, I mean, and they may simply be unaware is sometimes the reality, or a lot of people simply don't know about the objections to a lot of the language from research and professional circles. They just haven't been exposed to it because of this segregation. And sometimes people as well are, maybe they know, but are just not receptive. And I think that's a problem. So for example, I've tried to publish journal articles using particular language, and I've gone back the message, we don't do that. We don't do social advocacy in this journal. But they're actually censoring me and saying I can't use that language. That is in fact a form of social advocacy, because their position is not objectively right. So I think that there is a need for maybe less of a role from these sort of censoring bodies in determining what the language is used, and they should do something like what Christina is doing for the Autism in Adulthood Journal, of talking to the community and developing guidelines that are based on that consultation.
This last panel is very divergent. It has a lot of expertise and a lot of experience, a lot of different perspectives on many of the topics that have been raised and discussed. So I think this will be a lively conversation, particularly the question and answer period. So I am a developmental behavioral pediatrician. I have been part of the MIND since it started, and I also am the director of the Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And it's really my privilege to introduce, well, I'm actually not going to introduce this panel because I'm going to let them introduce themselves in the way that they would like to, and talk about what has been their role is either as an individual, autistic individual, and or a family member, and or someone who provides supports to autistic individuals and their families. So I will start with Heather and ask Heather to just introduce herself, describe her role as either a provider or a consumer. I hate that term. The populations that you have worked with, and kind of your different roles and experience that you bring.
Hello, I'm Heather Mitchell. Although I'm actually a chemistry researcher, but I do spend a lot of time working with particularly children on the autistic spectrum, primarily in a modified ABA approach, where I use more self-determination of the individual and have it be led from that perspective, basis other than guided by the therapist. And I use play with them in science experiments. So another one of my roles is I work with the Center for Autism Research and Technology at UVic, and I run the science portion of their time together, and I do science experiments, which helps the children really open up in an environment where they're more excited about and might be some of their strengths. And I really get to see the growth and sort of self-determination on their faces, particularly if they're interested in the subject matter. So those are my two areas. I also have done work with adults on the autism spectrum, and that's more to do with not othering them, actually allowing an adult who identifies as autistic to have their own self-determination and author their own lives, as Joseph Shepard's program he started at UVic, Authors with Autism, allowing them to have this determination to do what they want themselves. And it's kind of having a musical life or having a tragedy. If you put it in the terms of a film, people, no matter where your IQ is, they can author their own life and have their own self-determination to make choices. So that's kind of my approach.
Hi, my name's Auburn Stamer, and I am a psychologist by trade. I have been working in the autism field in early intervention and behavioral and developmental interventions for about 30 years, since before person first language. So now we're going back to identity first, which is not what it was called before. So it's really wonderful to have these conversations and to figure out how we need to adapt as our society adapts. My more recent work has been doing research in how to work with communities to translate evidence-based practices to make them work for community settings that are so very different than the research settings in which they were developed, that sometimes they're not at all useful in the community. So working with parents and autistic people and providers and funding agencies to figure out how we can do some better translation.
My name is Steve Ritter. I'm staff here at the SED, and one of the roles that I have at the SED is working with families and adults with disabilities to think about the services that they may be eligible for, that may benefit them. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm here. And another role that I have here is I do work with our business community in terms of how they can work with people with disabilities, hire people with disabilities, and use them within the strengths base that they have. And so I'm excited about the conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name's Patty Shutter, and I am a staff here at the SED as well. I coordinate the autism education initiatives for the center. Prior to coming here, I was in special education and worked as a program specialist and a special education classroom teacher. The work that I'm primarily doing now is doing dissemination and supporting the educational system here in California with learning more about autism and how to implement effective practices in classrooms.
Hey, I'm Kristen Godfrey. I'm a self-advocate and also a mother of 2 boys who are autistic, ages 7 and 10. I am a LEN graduate. I work here at UC Davis in IT communications. I have experience with a variety of service providers, from my children through school and healthcare, and also looking into really out-of-the-box therapies for them as an autistic individual myself. So I'm interested to hear more about what everybody has to say.
So the next question is sort of a combination of questions that we've talked about, and it's, if you could reflect on your experiences with supports in the communities in which you've worked, whether the services that you've received or the services that you've provided or the supports you've provided, would you please talk about how the impact of those supports are based on either sort of a medical or pathology-based model as opposed to a neurodiversity social model? And as you do that, please address what you see as the advantages or the challenges of applying a neurodiversity approach to developing and providing supports in your area of work.
I feel that supports are based on clinician-based approaches. It's difficult and lengthy to get a diagnosis. And then on top of dealing with the diagnosis, processing the changes with your family, incorporating appointments. Then there's the whole health versus school service aspect. and negotiating that and being afraid of, you know, if you qualify medically for a service, you may not qualify through school for a service, and then not telling the school that you're receiving medical services because then they might cut back on your school services. So there's all these little intricacies to services, and then dealing with ALTA, who will only cover things after you've exhausted all your other approaches, so your healthcare and your school, and then they're there afterwards, the regional center. And it was recommended to me not to really communicate between the three systems because you didn't want to lose out on any of the services you were already getting. So, and then there's many things that they don't cover, such as alternate therapies like dance, karate, music, hippotherapy, things that have been evidence-based proven to help children with, you know, a wide variety of things. And all of these out-of-pocket costs that parents are spending to try to help get their children the support and services they need. So I feel like allowing the individual or the parent and the children together to make more of a tailored plan to support the individual, one that takes the strengths like special interests and incorporates them, talents, and, you know, may not be the technical, you know, approach to things, but just take the individual as a whole into consideration when developing these services. And I feel like that's something that's really lacking today.
So thinking about the educational system and in particular special education, it's definitely based on a deficit model. You know, words like deficit and impairment and, you know, describing, you know, patterns of behavior that are atypical is all over the education code and all over the descriptions of the disabilities that would allow someone access to probably needed supports and services that someone may benefit from or need to benefit from their educational program. Having said that, you know, that's been sort of the historical model and the description of special education, but I believe that as a system, and I'm going to be really optimistic here, that the education system and the opportunity for an IEP lends itself really nicely to a neurodiversity framework. Universal design for learning is something that is taking hold in our state and something that is being not only messaged from the leadership of the state, but really that teachers and educators are asking for because they're recognizing that there is so much diversity in our classrooms. Not only neurodiversity, but cultural diversity and linguistic diversity. And teachers want to know how to best reach all of the students in their classrooms. So the Universal Design for Learning approach really is an approach that helps to break down barriers for any learner and provides opportunities for any learner to be able to participate, to be able to be engaged, and to be able to demonstrate what they know and what they've learned in a variety of different ways. To get this fully implemented, though, is going to require a major shift. And I think on the second question that you asked is, you know, what supports are needed to be able to help support sort of a neurodiversity framework in our systems. And it's going to take a lot of changing of mindset and culture and beliefs to sort of blow up this notion that there's an average student. There is no average. We've got to be able to teach to the entire range. And that needs to be supported through our teacher preparation programs, through our credentialing, and through the way that we're delivering services so that it's not based on qualifying or a disability, but really based on a need. But I do see things moving in that direction under our current leadership. Multi-tiered system of supports is another framework that's really being looked at and adopted statewide. And so I feel like we're moving in the right direction, and can continue to really embrace this notion of diversity and neurodiversity to make our classrooms and our students more successful.
So, well, on moving from school to an adult level, the system that we have now, when we talk about supports that are available, services and supports that are available for people to receive the kinds of assistance that they need to be fully successful, within the adult model, there are a few generic resources that exist for people with employment. For example, there's the American Job Centers that it's available to anyone who's looking for employment. Does not have to have a disability, do not have to either describe yourself that way or have a diagnosis to receive that. Most of our services, though, that would be beneficial to people do require that people either disclose or have an official diagnosis. And as Patrick was saying, we are in a situation to where people have to identify as being broken and have to identify as having some type of a need for these services. And the interesting thing is that within employment, I have a long background with coaching people, being a job coach and coaching people, and helping them to gain employment and then be successful in employment. And what I definitely see within employment is that when you are in a low-skilled position, accommodations are very difficult to receive. For people who have the ability to be in a higher skilled kind of employment, we see a much broader recognition of things, everything from chemical sensitivities, sound sensitivities. There are many ways that people within high-skilled kinds of jobs are accommodated on a very natural level. And so I see a huge disparity within what kinds of supports that people can receive without having to be, considered to have a deficit, depending on the types of jobs that you may be eligible for. I just want to go back to a little bit about the issue of pathology and services. Just tell two quick stories. The first one being that a few years ago, I was working with a person who I believed who was going to college, but I believed could receive services from the regional center. And the interesting thing that happened was that in order to qualify for that, you needed to have extensive documentation that the disability occurred before the age of 18 and met a variety of different kinds of issues. And the person was in a determination meeting being told that they were not eligible for regional center services. And the person who was in that determination meeting looked down at the paperwork and was kind of fumbling through, avoiding eye contact as they were saying why this person couldn't receive services, and said, oh, here is a speech assessment from when she was 4 or 5 years old. Based on this one piece of documentation, you are now eligible. The thing that's frustrating about that to me is that her needs had not changed. She was the same person. And the fact that a piece of paper that was from 20 plus years ago was the determining factor that she could then receive the supports that she needed, that was very, very frustrating to me. I just want to tell another real quick story about again, the way that our services can pathologize people. We have a man who works with me and who's on the spectrum, and he had a job coach that was here assisting him. And on a day that there was a special event happening, none of us were working. We were supposed to be going off and enjoy a celebration. The job coach saw this one individual within this entire group who was not doing what he thought his job was. And he pulled him up short in the middle of all his colleagues and said that he was being irresponsible and that he wasn't doing, he really needed to be doing his work. And we had to pull, and the cool thing that happened was because he was here, because he was not in some segregated site where he was receiving services in a way that people with disabilities oftentimes did, everybody pulled him short. I had probably 5 phone calls. It didn't happen in my presence. I had probably 5 phone calls within 5 minutes saying this job coach cannot come back. And I just thought that it was so cool to see the difference between what would have been considered a normal practice, that in order for someone to be working who has a disability, they have to be on task all the time. And they did not recognize that none of us were working. We were all in this different mode of celebrating, but because he saw this man as an individual with a disability, he was being held to a different standard. And I just think that's really a very telling kind of story about the way that people can be perceived, depending on if they are considered to have a pathology, a disability, or if they're just another person working in a different site.
So let's go back to babies. I'll think about sort of the early intervention perspective, and I want to think sort of about 2 things, because I think they're a little bit different. One is accessing services, and the other is service delivery. So our service access system now is a medical deficit-based model, for sure. Parents do not come for an evaluation and say, I'm here because my child is really great at reading, and I want you to assess that. They come in and say, hey, my child's not talking, and I need some support. And I can't write a report that says, this child's great at reading, please provide some early intervention. It just doesn't work. Whether that's right or not, I don't know. It's complicated, and I really resonated with me what Patrick was saying about how we're teaching skills all the time to all kids, right? And how can we make this a typical way of moving forward in terms of just teaching kids the skills they need without it being deficit-based? And right now our system isn't set up for it. We're set up to provide additional services only to those kids and families who meet these specific criteria that are relatively rigorous, right? And so that's a challenge, I think, for us in terms of neurodiversity. I think, like Patty was saying, we're in the ideal world moving toward a more strength-based, partnership-based approach to intervention. If you read what you're supposed to be doing. Now, is everyone doing this? I didn't say that. But I think we're moving toward having families and people and kids, I'm talking about early intervention, really be involved in determining what the goals of the services are, what the plans are, what the interventions are, where they're going to be implemented, and a focus on kind of a combination between teaching kids to reach their best developmental potential and changing the environment. So those 2 things sort of work, hopefully, together. An individualized family service plan is developed really to be the family's plan, not the provider's plan. Now, does it always work out that way? No, but I think at least we're talking about it now versus, when I started in this field, it was like, your child's autistic, and Mom, it's your fault, and so to me, we've come a long way with a long way to go. And in terms of the intervention approaches, the state of the art, and I'm sure Heather's going to talk a little bit more about this, is really moving away from those highly structured behavioral strategies to developmentally appropriate strategies that build on the children's motivation to learn, right? So a bit of helping parents learn, their child's learning differently, and parents are probably feeling frustrated that their usual strategies for engaging this child aren't working. So helping them learn how to change how they're interacting so it works for them and their child, and then they can get to communication and understanding. And so I'm hopeful that those things are coming from self-determination, and that moving self-determination into the regular vernacular will help parents come in and not their first question be, is he going to grow out of autism, or what do we need to do to fix it? but be more, how can I support his potential? Because I realize that autism is just another way of being, and there will be lots of strengths that come with this as well. So having that be part of our regular societal conversation, I think, will help when parents come in, have them see it differently, right? But I think the biggest challenge is our medical model of identification and how we determine who gets supports, like you were saying.
So regardless of the type of service that's being offered to the person that's identifying as autistic, the person will be aware if there's ableism being delivered or not, and if there's empathy, and if there's actual care, and if the service provider feels that the person can do something. There's going to be that awareness regardless of where on the autism spectrum, if they're highly functional or non-highly functional, they're going to be aware within their environment, and they're going to pick up on that. And as Joseph was mentioning early today, that has a big impact on how the person with autism perceives themselves. One where they develop high levels of anxiety and depression, and the other one where they have a more positive self-image and develop their own self-determination, or are able to author their own life and do things that are important to them based on what they feel they want to do with their life. And that's when I provide services to children on the spectrum, that's what I am essentially trying to do. Some of the time it's more related to science and fostering that ability to connect with something that might be their special interest, and then helping them realize what that can mean for their futures and job possibilities. And that is a unique thing in some circumstances, because oftentimes children come from environments where they're told that there isn't going to be much hope for them and things of that nature, which has a devastating impact on the individual. So it's important that even if there's only a few communities this person belongs to where they have that place where they can feel secure and valued as an individual, it's highly important.
So as someone who was trained in the medical model, as a medical professional, I really think to change this paradigm, we have to change how we train healthcare professionals. And it's been something that I have been working on 35 years since I've been at UC Davis, training medical students, pediatric residents, and fellows in developmental behavioral pediatrics. So, I mean, there's a reason there's a medical model, and there are illnesses that need to be fixed, that we can't fix by changing the environment. But I think we need to really start training healthcare professionals to understand how that medical model fits in a broader social model, and to really try and understand how we can help families and individuals through helping them with sort of healthcare decisions, and expand the way that we sort of approach how we address both illness, but certainly how we think about disability or lifelong issues that we can't fix as healthcare professionals. There is a concept that I think is growing in both pediatric and adult practice called shared decision-making, particularly around issues that have a lot of medical uncertainty, so we're not sure that we can fix it. So cancer treatment is one example. So, we can't, we could talk about how can we prevent cancer using a social model, how can we prevent a lot of medical illnesses that need to be treated, thinking about social determinants of health. Clearly, trying to expand how we think about medicine and health needs to expand and think about the social determinants of health and how our social environment from prenatal life all the way through death are impacted by our environment and all of those social determinants. But I think if we can, as healthcare professionals, embrace a shared decision-making model, then I think that's one way that is familiar to healthcare professionals to approach some of these issues of how can we provide supports, how can we fix or cure what we can, and how do we then approach the kinds of issues that impact health if you're a physician, or family functioning, and really provide the support that individuals need to meet their full potential, whether it's to be healthy, to be happy, to be mentally healthy and happy, and have the kinds of choices and options that we all want to have in our own lives and in the lives of the people that we love. So I think it's a big challenge, and I think, as Aubin said, our healthcare system is based on getting services because you have a problem and a deficit, and it's something that we want to try and fix or correct. So I think that's going to be a difficult model to change, but I think we have to figure out how we can start making some of those changes. And so I really believe that not only do we need to address it through how we train healthcare professionals, but we need all of you to help us learn better, because we have to be lifelong learners, and we can be trained in a certain model, but hopefully you will find providers who are willing to listen, to do shared decision-making with you, and listen to what you feel like you need for supports, and try and figure out through the systems that we have an impact on how we can help you meet your needs. So I'm going to, I think, open it up for questions.
Kristen, I was curious if you wouldn't mind speaking about your own, I guess, identification, and I guess then how that informed your parenting.
Well, I feel like in comparison to other parents that I've encountered that have autistic children, I'm a little out there, because I kind of just let my kids not do whatever they want, but I definitely understand where they're coming from. So I just try to kind of put myself in their shoes, and even though they're boys, you know, there's some commonalities. Sometimes I really have to sit and say, wow, what is going on with these kids? You know, I didn't experience this growing up. And because they're boys, you know, the different issues and, the messes and the Band-Aids and all this stuff that, you know, I never had. But, you know, I just try to be generally good-natured about it and understanding, and just, you know, they're little people who are trying to figure out who they're going to be, and just try to inspire them to be the best version of that they can, and whatever makes them happy is what I want to continue to do.
Thanks to everyone for your for the nice panel. I just wanted to say, like, it has also been seen that in case of autistic people, the research shows that they are more likely to be like trans or gender non-conforming. So how many of those resources can we like, we also think about safety in terms of like the fact that we want to be treated as we are, and not like how most people see us as, and like what do you think are the resources for like gender non-conforming or non-binary people just like me?
I would just, say that there's a lot of intersectionality that happens and as far as I've seen some research, I'm not an expert in this area. I've seen some experts that there is in fact a greater level. It doesn't seem like it's a huge percentage, but there is some. But regarding the issue that you bring up, it's one that there are the groups that are supporting and that are set up for the issues of transgender, the range of issues regarding sexual identity as well as personal identity. And I would just suggest that that they take advantage of those generic services and agencies that are focused on those issues.
There clearly is a lot of intersectionality, and there's growing research to show that there's a lot more. I think so on the anecdotal standpoint, I think there is so much overlap that of the healthcare providers, I try to do autism trainings for healthcare providers left and right, and the most receptive have been ones that work in gender dysphoria clinics, because they're the ones that are saying, half my patients are on the spectrum, I need to know this. So I think it's interesting, because again, in the people who are practicing in gender dysphoria clinics, they notice, oh wait, there's all these autistic patients. And then we're also noticing it that amongst people who are diagnosed with autism, there's much higher levels of gender nonconformity of the entire range. There's one study that I know of that is actually looking at non-clinical populations, just community populations, and yes, it seems like autistic traits and gender nonconformity, of however they had defined it on theirs, have association. So I do think it's something we need to be extremely cognizant of, because it's another form of diversity, and it's a really important one for us to not be getting into those segments that Patrick was warning about, that my interest is this or your interest is this, because oftentimes they really overlap in a lot of ways.
Because I think it's gender non-conformity has become quite a big issue in the autistic community itself, and one that the community is very well aware of, and I'd say the best resources for dealing with that often comes from other autistic people. When Lawson, who I referenced earlier, went through gender reassignment and so on, and that's becoming more common in the community, and it's the most acceptance I've seen has been other autistic adults, because funnily enough, a lot of us aren't that bothered about gender roles and what the meanings are and statuses of them, so it tends to be a very accepting community for people who are gender non-conforming or what have you. So
It's been amazing to see throughout the talks that we've had today the different links to the LGBTQ like rights movements and acceptance and inclusiveness. So I was struck by a bit of an idea that we have the LGBTQ now included in our health education, and it's part of law that it must be taught, or at least offered to be taught to students in certain grade levels. And wouldn't it be fascinating, and do you know of anything, perhaps Patty, in educational policy or educational movements towards having like neuro and biodiversity or disabilities added into like the curriculum in maybe K or first grade, as students are first starting to notice the differences around them?
No, but wouldn't that be amazing? Wouldn't that be amazing? I'm not aware of anywhere explicitly in the standards where it's called out. In fact, we've talked often about, wouldn't it be amazing if we had a history of disability class in high school, and just to be able to infuse that. So, but I think there are really multiple opportunities to embed it within the standards. And I think we have great examples of where that's happening. Even locally within our community, some of the nonprofits who are working with schools to go in and do disability awareness and neurodiversity awareness and ability awareness, and really raising the understanding of diversity and neurodiversity. So yeah, I'm an advocate. Let's do it.
And just for people who are local, if you are interested in bringing in that to the school, there is a Touch of Understanding, which is a program that goes into schools and has some amazing conversations. I know that it started off with physical disabilities, but there are a number of speakers who are on the spectrum who do those presentations, and it's been very well received.
So I work in children's mental health, and until I think really the ACA and then the DSM change, we never really had clients that were autistic, and if they were referred to us, because I work with a Medi-Cal-based agency, we would have to refer them back out because autism always had to be the primary diagnosis, and now with the changes in the DSM, it doesn't have to be. So we have this new influx of amazingly diverse children coming in. And I'm curious if you have any suggestions or ideas on how we, and myself as a provider, can be more, I don't know, just better at like working with this particular population, because in my experience, both also provider and a parent, there are differences. Like traditional therapeutic CBT and play therapy modalities just don't always work the same. And so I'm just curious if you have suggestions for myself or maybe my agency of how we can be better therapists, be better at our job.
So first of all, let's talk after this about a research project we have going on that provides some training. So my colleague, Lauren Berkman-Frazee in San Diego, researches this particular area, and in the clinic she worked with, she's in San Diego, turns out about 20% of kids in most outpatient mental health clinics seeing publicly funded clients can't see kids because they have autism, but most of the kids coming in with disruptive behavior disorders and many with anxiety also have co-occurring autism, and the providers don't have any training at all. And so what she's been teaching them to do in a program developed in collaboration with providers is do things like structure the environment in a way that they can then learn the CBT strategies, have parents come in and work with them to how to take things out into the community and really involve the family and the individual in the intervention. And so using some of the kind of traditional autism strategies to structure that therapeutic environment so the kids can learn those kind of anxiety reducing strategies a little bit better. But I'd be happy to give you some more specifics afterward, but it's a really good point that now that we know that there are these co-occurring mental health challenges and they're recognized, right? You all knew before, now they're recognized. How do we help address that better?
Well, we worked so hard on being, so trauma-informed was like the new thing that came out a while back, and so now I feel like we need to be like neurodiversity informed, and so it's kind of my pet thing at work. Like they just send them all to me pretty much, and like they don't teach it in grad school. They just don't, and so I'm glad that this summit, this stuff is coming out, and we have more resources coming up.
With the exception of Heather, everybody at the table, including our moderator, are people who work in or associated with the Mind Institute. And I wonder if we, if you guys could just sort of, even if it's just to wax poetic, about some changes we might be able to put in place sooner rather than later in our own institute, in our own, here at UC Davis. And I don't mean changing the medical model. We can't do that overnight. If you can, Robin, that would be amazing. But other practical and maybe sort of baby steps things. So I'm sure, like myself, this has been a thought-provoking day. So I wanted to just provide a moment to sort of pick your brains about that. And Heather, please you jump in too and tell us what we could do better. I'm just sort of thinking about starting at home and sort of seeing where we can make small changes that might make be the start of that sea change that we all seem to be agreeing that needs to be happening.
I'll just start it. I think we really need to be doing a better job of doing community-based participatory research and including autistic individuals, parents as well, in how we think about our research, how we think about, how we talk about our research, how we disseminate information, and really think about, not from sort of purely scientific and deficit model, just how we think about it and how we present, how we develop our research ideas and think about our protocols and make that shift and just be very cognizant about it. And I think it is a big change to have always been very thoughtful about writing, and we talk about children with autism instead of autistic children in our manuscripts, that, and if I'm editing a paper and they, it used to be if they said autistic children, we would flip it around and say, these are children with autism. They're children first. Well, they have autism. They might also have something else. So, I do think it's a challenge if you haven't met someone, to know whether they would like to be seen as a person with autism or if they want to be seen as an autistic person. And I can't make that assumption until I know people better. And so for me, that's a challenge because I kind of don't know initially what to say, and I wouldn't, you know, so now I ask. But I do think it is just having to be open and being willing to feel vulnerable in maybe asking that. But I also think it's important to ask and not make assumptions, because I know that some parents don't want their kids to be called autistic.
Patty and I were madly texting while you were talking about Aspire and thinking about how to do what Robin's saying and better incorporate more. We have great community participation in our Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, a wonderful community advisory board, and all the relationships these guys have built. And I think we can do a much better job of incorporating that partnership in many of our basic science research projects. And we have a couple people starting to do that in other areas, 22Q and things like that. And so we've been working toward figuring out how to best do that, and I think that would be huge. And then I just think bringing these ideas to our clinicians, to our interventionists, to think about how we're communicating with families, how we're communicating with everyone when we're talking about neurodiversity and autism, that this is how we start talking about it and retrain ourselves as we're training the next generation of practitioners and scientists and families.
This is not unique to the Mind Institute, but one of the biggest challenges for people to gain employment is the fact that we rely on interviews. And I sit on plenty of interview panels here at the Mind Institute, and we're asked to ask a standard set of questions, and we're asked to, to score on a very rational kind of level. And one of the things that's so frustrating to me is that interview is probably the least effective way for someone to demonstrate whether or not they would be a good employee. And I do know that there is some work being done to not within the Mind Institute per se, I would say, but in general, for people to expand the use of internships and other kinds of opportunities where people can come, demonstrate their skills, be evaluated on the actual skills that are required for the job, and then be hired from that. And to me, that would be one of the biggest things that we could do to open up the opportunities for people who have incredible skills, but don't have the social finesse of trying to figure out exactly what you're supposed to say on an interview, because it is a very weird, unusual process that really, again, has no reflection on whether or not you would be an effective employee.
I think that this is a great example of things that we can be doing at the Mind Institute to be able to really help expand and bring these sort of silos together more. I was excited when I saw the word summit, because it's not a talk, it's not a conference, it's an opportunity for some real strategic conversation to start taking place. So I would say I would love to see more of this kind of thing. And even with the amazing talks that we heard today, having those opportunities to then sit down and strategically, across all of these different facets, have conversations about what does it mean for research and education and families and to really have those dialogues. I think this has been great. It's really expanded my understanding a lot.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was created in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other brain disorders are helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.